Welcome to Light Overheat with Professor David Yamane. This week I want to talk about big denominators and estimates of gun ownership rates. Last week I talked about how guns are normal and normal people use guns, which isn't to discount the negative outcomes that happen with guns and gun owners, but I think it's important to put those in the context of some very large denominators. The number of guns in the United States, the number of gun-owning households, and the number of individuals who own guns. And once we put those in that context, we can better understand the risk posed by guns and gun owners. So I estimated, using data from the Pew Research Center, that 30% of American adults own guns. That's over 76 million people. Now, we also know that the Pew Research Center, even though it does a good survey, also underestimates the proportion of Americans who own guns in the United States. And there are some good reasons why surveys underestimate gun ownership in the United States. The first reason is systematic non-response. So every survey asks people to answer a particular question, like, do you own a gun? Some people will answer that question, yes or no. Some people will refuse to answer that question or say that they don't know. And we have good reason to believe that a large percentage of the people who refuse or say they don't know, the systemic non-response, are actually gun owners who are saying that they don't own guns. Secondly, we have what we could call false negatives. These people answer the question. They don't say don't know, or they don't refuse to answer the question, but they are gun owners who say that they don't own guns. These are the sort of people who jokingly say that they've lost all their firearms in a tragic boating accident. They just don't want to tell a surveyor that they own guns, but they also don't want to refuse to answer the question or say they don't know. Now, there are various reasons for this, but one interesting reason to think about is a group of people who have historically been marginalized in society, who have historically had their gun ownership rights questioned and challenged. And I'm talking about here African Americans. We have very good reason to believe that African Americans underreport their gun ownership because they simply don't want people to know that they have firearms, and they have good reason to be suspicious of people knowing that they have firearms. Now, we don't know what proportion of the population are reporting false negatives in terms of the gun ownership question, but we do know that it's some portion. And so when we think about the reported rates of gun ownership in surveys, we need to factor in those people who are systemically non-responsive or who are reporting false negatives. And when we do that, we get an estimate that's more along the lines of, I believe, 33 to 37% gun ownership rate, rather than the 30% reported by Pew, or even less reported by organizations like the General Social Survey. Now, some people have raised the possibility of false positives, that some people want to try to virtue signal and say that they own a gun, even though they don't. But I just feel like the people who are likely to virtue signal with respect to guns are not likely to be the kinds of people who want to tell a surveyor that they own guns. Recently, in recognition of some of the challenges of doing face-to-face or phone interviews and getting very low response rates, and if you're asking about guns, having issues of systemic non-response and false negatives, is organizations using what are called opt-in surveys. So there are survey agencies out there who constitute panels of individuals who agree in advance to be surveyed about various issues. And when they're asked whether they want to participate in a survey about guns in particular, we might expect there to be both a higher response rate and perhaps even more honesty in people's responses to gun ownership questions, because they have already trust the organization that's asking them questions enough that they've opted into their panels. So there are actually not one, but two national firearms surveys fielded in 2021 both of them using an opt-in design, and not surprisingly, they find that 31 to 32% of adults say that they own guns. This is, again, higher than Pew. It's much higher than the General Social Survey, and I think gets closer to what the actual rate of gun ownership is in the United States. With the number of new gun owners that we have in the great gun buying spree of the COVID era, I think it's not unrealistic for me to increase my estimate from 33 to 37% to perhaps even 40% of the US adult population today owning guns, or over 100 million people. Again, guns are normal, and normal people use guns. I also want to talk about the changing face of gun ownership that we see in national surveys like these two. So stay tuned for next week's video in which I'll take up that question.